Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch event for World Justice Project EUROVOICES. I'm Lauren Kitts, Director of Engagement at the World Justice Project, and on behalf of our organization, I'm honored to welcome everyone joining us, both those of us here in Brussels and joining online. At today's event, we will introduce to you EUROVOICES, a new research initiative from the World Justice Project that captures the experiences and perceptions of the rule of law in 110 subnational regions across all 27 EU member states. EUROVOICES draws from in-depth surveys of more than 72,000 people in the EU, both local people and legal experts. This data provides a uniquely comprehensive and granular picture of the state of democracy, justice, and the rule of law. With this research, the World Justice Project seeks to support evidence-based policymaking and help decision makers at all levels advance key policy priorities. During today's event, we will share the project's main findings, explain the research methodology, provide a tour of the interactive website, and host a discussion with a special guest on the relevance and implications of the findings for policymaking in the EU. And one housekeeping note before we start, we will have a brief Q&A after the presentation. So for those of us here in the room, there are cards on your chairs with pens. So feel free to write your questions on the cards and we will collect them later in the presentation. And if you're joining us online, please write your question in the chat box and we will get to it. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Alejandro Ponce, the World Justice Project's Chief Research Officer, to present EUROVOICES. But before we start, we have a short video to set the stage.
Justice, democracy, fundamental rights and transparency are the basis for a healthy society.
Rechtsstaatlichkeit bedeutet für mich, dass wir Menschen wählen, die nur das Beste für die Gesellschaft im Sinn haben.
Dass wir alle erstmal die gleichen Rechte haben.
Significa che mi sento sicuro.
At the World Justice Project, we traveled all over the European Union to hear your voice.
Democracia, derecho a elegir libremente, sin ser coaccionado por nada ni por nadie.
Rechtvaardigheid betekent dat ik gelijke behandeling krijg en betekent dat ik me veilig voel.
La transparence veut dire que les médias sont libres.
In 27 member states, across 110 regions, we spoke to over 8,000 legal experts and surveyed more than 64,000 local people in rural and urban communities. We worked to understand how government institutions perform, how democracy and fundamental rights are protected, and how justice is delivered by listening to the perspectives and experiences of the people living all over the EU. In the midst of growing inequalities and polarization, the World Justice Project EUROVOICES delivers original and robust data that identifies strengths and weaknesses in the rule of law, the very foundation of communities, of justice, opportunity, and peace in the European Union.
Hello, and welcome everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to present the World Justice Project EUROVOICES project. The rule of law is the foundation or foundational pillar for achieving peace, justice, strong democracies, and from fostering economic growth and investment. The systematic compliance of just laws in a fairly, effectively, consistent way, and in a way that respects human rights is key for communities to thrive. Yet around the world, the rule of law is increasingly under threat. Even the European Union, with its strong foundations, have felt this pressure. So it's more important than ever to strengthening the rule of law, and this has to start at the international, national, and local level. To make progress within the European Union, we need reliable data on how people in the different regions of the 27 member states experience the rule of law, view the rule of law in their everyday lives, in their own communities. This information is essential for policy making, for designing policies that effectively address the citizens' needs, including policies related to the cohesion policy. So the World Justice Project is committed to this transformation by building knowledge, raising awareness, and stimulating action to advance the rule of law. Over the last 15 years, we have gathered information and collected data from more than 450,000 individuals around the world to understand and to measure how the rule of law is experienced in different countries and in different contexts. At the World Justice Project, we also believe that solutions to strengthen the rule of law have to be developed locally. So the indicators, data, visualizations that we're going to see today represent the most ambitious effort to quantify and capture the perceptions and experiences of people living in 110 regions of the European Union on governance, justice, and the rule of law. So it's a huge effort to amplify the citizens' voices and to integrate policy making into, or policy views into policy making and decision making. So to produce this amount of information, we have followed a robust methodology. I'm going to show you a video that explains the conceptual framework as well as the processes for data collection and data validation.
World Justice Project EUROVOICES provides uniquely comprehensive and granular data on the state of justice, governance, and the rule of law in the European Union. This new data reflects the perceptions and experiences of people living in 110 regions across the 27 EU member states.
The EuroVoices conceptual framework builds upon the methodology the World Justice Project uses to measure the rule of law globally in our Rule of Law Index, with adaptation that reflects the institutional architecture of the EU. During the design phase, our team conducted a thorough review of EU surveys, databases, reports, and rule of law frameworks, and consulted with experts from various sectors.
We then set out to measure a wide variety of rule of law indicators that are organized into 3 thematic reports.
The first EuroVoices report, Democracy and Fundamental Rights, covers topics related to checks on government powers, government respect for checks on power, civic participation, and fundamental rights.
The second EuroVoices report, Justice and Safety, includes indicators on civil justice, criminal justice, and public safety.
Finally, the third EuroVoices report, Transparency and Corruption, includes data on control for corruption, transparency and access to information, as well as administrative proceedings, regulatory enforcement, and property rights.
To calculate these indicators, we gathered original survey data across the EU, tapping into 2 distinct sources. One is our expert scorecard, which captures insights from over 8,000 independent, local legal experts and practitioners from a range of disciplines. The other is People's Voices, which draws on household surveys of more than 64,000 respondents to reflect how people across the EU perceive and experience the rule of law.
Our team analyzed the data and conducted both quantitative and qualitative checks to ensure that results were robust. Our checks included comparing our data to trusted third-party sources and official databases, reviewing reports on the rule of law, justice, and governance, using AI to analyze thousands of newspaper articles across the 27 EU countries, and conducting expert interviews to contextualize findings and understand regional differences.
The result of this exercise is a library of people-centered indicators on the rule of law in the EU at both the regional and national levels.
Now, World Justice Project EuroVoices data empowers decision makers to identify evidence-based policy priorities that equitably advance sustainable development and reinforce a critical EU founding principle, the rule of law.
To learn more about World Justice Project EuroVoices and explore the full results, check out our website.
So you can explore the data. You can look at the information just for the derived from the experts, as well as information coming from the public. And there are different ways of doing this. So for example, we're looking at the front page. In the front page, you can see the videos. You can also see some of the key findings, as well as enter into some of the portals for the experts, as well as from the public, or access some of the reports that we just heard about. If we go to the expert scorecard, here's when you can see the evaluation that the legal practitioners in the different regions of the EU make about different rule of law dimensions. For example, it's access to legal aid or legal capability. The information is presented in different ways, so you can look at it through maps, just color maps highlighting the scores for each one of the different regions in a standardized color scale. You can also look at the information in the form of charts. So the charts are organized by country, where each data point represents a region, allows an easier comparison. And also you can access the information in tables, where you can see the scores for each one of the different regions. At the same time, you can access people's voices, and in people's voices, you can explore a topic. Just simply use a phrase, for example, public safety, and then look at the different questions. There are selected questions on this particular topic, and then look at how what people think about public safety, in this case, how safe they feel when walking at night in the different regions, explore the data by demographics, for example, by income or by gender. And as before, also, you can look at the visualization either in terms of charts or in terms of tables. You can also download part of the data sets, as well as the questionnaires that were used, the data maps that were used to generate the expert scores, as well as extensive methodology documents that really just review each one of the steps that we took for the production of these indicators. Finally, you can also look at the reports. So the report is an effort to organize the findings in a thematic way. For example, here is the indicator, the report on justice and safety. So here you can find across the different categories of civil justice, for example, just on legal capability or access to legal aid, some of the findings coming either from the scorecard or from the public. So on their people's voices or on their expert scorecard. So each one of the different reports is organized in the same way, so you can access all the relevant information or the most relevant information for the topic in each one of these reports, and these are available on the web as well as on PDF. So this really represents an effort to contribute to evidence-based policymaking and to collaborate with governments at all levels just to identify strengths, weaknesses, understand issues in a better way, and make better and more informed decisions. So now let me just present some of the main findings. There are several findings in the report. Obviously, there are some of the more specific findings, but these are some of the big lessons we present, about 14 findings. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of the most representatives that we see in the region. First, in the area of democracy and fundamental rights. So fundamental rights in Europe are well protected. So the freedom of assembly, association, expressions are well protected across most of the regions in the EU. However, there are some regions that are falling short in upholding these essential rights. Discrimination is a challenge across the EU. So we included questions about experiences with discrimination, with different types of discrimination over the previous year. What we found is over 25% of people face discrimination during the past year in approximately 80% of the EU regions. On justice and safety, we included a model on legal needs to really understand just when people have a problem, what is the experience that they have. Something that they find first is that legal problems are ubiquitous. This is a finding that is shared just around the world. In the EU, when people face legal problems, usually they have quality, they have access to quality of information and advice, and to a lesser extent, to appropriate assistance and representations. However, there are important variations between the different regions. In criminal justice, in general, criminal justice is considered effective, but not everyone feels that they benefit equally. So most people in the EU agree that the criminal justice system is effective and respects the victims of rights, the rights of victims and the of those of the accused. However, many believe that the system do not treat everyone in the same way. On transparency and corruption, for the most part, people do not think that state institutions are corrupt. So across the EU, most people do not believe that courts, parliaments, or other state institutions are corrupt. However, there are some concerns regarding national governments and parliaments in about 1/3 just of the regions. And also, just in more than half of the EU countries and regions, people believe that political parties are the most corrupt compared to other state institutions. The anti-corruption measures in general across the EU are seen as ineffective so far. And when we look at the information from the experts, we see that authorities are perceived as transparent and providing information, and believe that local authorities provide information in a timely and responsible manner. So some trends around the region. So first, governance is important for development. So across region where we see strong democratic governance, and this is measured by all the different variables that we have in the general population survey, for example, here, we see a stronger economic development. So what we have here is a representation of the average for each one of the questions that we have for the more developed and transition regions versus the less developed regions. And what we see is that in most cases, most of the data points are above the 45-degree line, so which shows that in more developed regions, the scores are higher. We also see that people have more trust in local authorities, just overall. Across the EU, about 52% of people trust local authorities, and in comparison, only 41% of people trust national authorities, and this is true in all countries in the EU. Then people in urban and rural areas largely agree on justice and rule of law. So when we compare respondents in the two different regions, again, this is just the average for all the different responses for the questions that we have, we see that most of the questions align really over the 45-degree lines, which shows that the responses for both rural, people living in rural and urban areas are very similar.
Great. Well, thank you, Alejandro, for taking us through the data and helping the audience start to get to know EuroVoices. So I would now like to invite to the stage Antonella Valmorbida for a discussion on more of what we can learn from the data. So by way of introduction, Antonella is the Secretary General of ALDA, the European Association for Local Democracy. She's an expert in promoting civil society participation, local democracy, and good governance in Europe. And through ALDA, she currently manages a member network of 300 local authorities and civic groups in over 40 countries in Europe and worldwide. Antonella, thank you so much for joining us. And for our attendees, just please note if you do have questions for Alejandro or Antonella, please write them down. We're going to be collecting them in the next few moments over the course of their discussion. And for those of you online, please write them in the chat and we will get to them. Over to you both.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Antonella, for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. Just as a way of introduction, probably you can tell us ALDA has played a key role in fostering strong democracies at the local level and also fostering civic participation. So can you tell us about your initial reactions when you of this report and the findings of this report?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alejandro. Hello, everyone. And I discovered this room in this building, which I didn't know. Well, of course, the impression was, first one was a lot of data. So congratulations for having so many elements. I also think that the questions were the good ones to give an overview of the resilience of democracy here in Europe. I think that it touches the right points, and I really recommend all of you to go through the results and the data that I have emerged. And I also liked this possibility to see the regional maps. So it's not a research country by country only, but it's also a research which highlights the differences within the country. And that gives certainly more elements for us to understand. And at the EU level, there is an attention to regional differences. And this data here shows that this is the right way to go. So there are differences in our countries that need to be taken into consideration. We also see when you overlap the maps, you start seeing also places where you really have a problem. Yeah, so we know that there are places, regions, countries in Europe that pose a certain problem and issue, and we see that this overlapping of the maps one onto each other, you start seeing that the colors are piling up on some countries. I also was happy and comforted by the fact that in terms of trust, local governments still remain the strong part of the governance. I think that if I'm not mistaken, the results are that 45% of the population also express a strong trust in the local governments, and that actually shows that this proximity and this direct contact with the local institutions is an asset, and that's comforting our work. I also want to say some surprises and unsurprises. So, of course, not so much surprise when we see that there are issues on misinformation and this kind of study, and what we also think, I mean, these databases elements, but we will talk about that also later, is important in policy making, and we will maybe touch on this point later. I was also maybe one of the elements that surprised me, and we spoke about that in the coffee before coming to the room, is this issue of judiciary. There is in the EU, and this is a strong point for the EU, the conception, the idea that judiciary works, broadly not so much corrupted, but there is an element in the research that says it's difficult to access because it's expensive and it's complicated. So if judiciary is broadly in every country of Europe considered still reliable, but it's difficult to access. And then the result is that it's also a problem for those who have no money. So you decide whether to access or not, or whether it is too complicated and you know that you are going to lose. And of course, judiciary is part of a sustainable democracy. So we need to be careful about that.
Thank you. And I want to go back to one of the points that you mentioned, because as we saw, some of the fundamental freedoms, the freedom of assembly, association, expression, are well protected in Europe, with the exception of some cases. But you mentioned misinformation, and I want to go back to that point. We didn't show it in the results, but you can see it online. One of the findings that we have is that in 25 member states, a majority of people believe that senior officials use misinformation to shape public opinion. And in 18 member states, officials are seen discrediting official media and civil society. So I wanted to ask you, just how does ALDA address misinformation, just given just how prevalent just people believe on these trends?
Yes, as I said, I think that the lack of information, or maybe I will say the lack of good information, because we have a lot of information, but the lack of good information is the elephant in the room of democracy everywhere, and also including here in Europe. We all live in our bubble of information, and sometimes Alejandro is shocking, you know. So we tend to live in a bubble, not only the famous Brussels bubble, but we are all living in a certain bubble, including our policymaker, you know, and that also affects, in general, the quality of journalism as well. So our members, mostly local authorities, there is one part of our work about local journalism. For example, there is also an issue of monopoly of groups of information, and it's really difficult to have a proper information influencing the policy making, because you don't see the other side of the coin. You don't perceive the other side of the coin. And we see the result of these elections where our policymakers don't see a part of the population, or the frustration of a part of a population, and that it is expressed in these extreme votes that we have been experiencing in Europe. How do we do that? And how do we work in ALDA in this sense? Well, we try to disseminate good information on also sensitive issues. So I give you an example. ALDA is working on a migration hub. We work on thematic hubs. So we have 7 thematic hubs where our members, both local authorities and civil society, and our partners globally, receive substantial information from different sources, like, for example, migration. We have a strong migration hub, and we are informing our members, some of them are local authorities and civil society, including policymakers, of the different components of this. Because migration, I quote this example because this is a typical misinformation context. Yeah, like they are invading us, or, you know, they are all criminals, or, you know, these kind of things. And data, for example, in Italy, we had a very strong discussions in these days. There was a minister that said that violence against women were basically also due because of very big presence of migrants in Italy. And the data shows, and the importance of the data is that, for what we know, only 0.4% of violence against women is due to migration population. The others are Italians. So we also need to mention these elements of information. So what do we do on a very political, manipulated topics as migration? Yeah, in our network, we train and we inform our members. We have information sessions to our members in understanding the phenomenon, but also giving elements on data and on what is the system of language, because you need to explain the language. Migrants is something, a refugee is something, asylum is another thing. So we also need to train our members. We do projects within our migration hub, but also the other thematic hubs of ALDA. We are working on environment and fighting climate change, gender and human rights and anti-discrimination. We work on youth and digitalization and local economic development, and also the practices of citizens' participation. So we do information to our members, to our staff as well, and try to increase a little bit the level of information and good quality information. We work on participative democracy, and this is also something that I would like to raise, so that our policymakers are also engaged with citizens between the elections. So this citizens' participation and all the practices of participative democracy create a direct connection between the policymakers, at least at the local level, and the citizens. This is also something that the EU tried to do with the Conference on the Future of Europe to a certain extent, but these citizens and these panel assemblies and this direct contact with citizens is also a way to overcome misinformation or an immense level of disinformation.
Thank you, Antonella. And this is, as you mentioned, it's the elephant in the room. We have seen it as well. We have seen it just as well in some of the surveys that we have done in other parts of the world as well, that people think the same, and that this influences the perceptions that people may have about certain topics. And you provided very good alternatives on information and participatory democracy. I want to talk for a moment about a finding that just is simple, but it's quite relevant and shocking. So the finding about discrimination, just I mentioned that just in the EU, 1 out of every 4 people in just the majority of the countries, in almost 80% of the regions, just have experienced discrimination. And we have also analyzed questions about gender inequality, and we have seen as well just reflections of gender inequality in employment and so on, perceptions. And when we compare the outcomes about just how women perceive certain issues, we have seen some interesting differences. So I would like to ask you, just in your experience, what are some of the strategies that decision makers should prioritize to turn really just into this promise of equality just before the law?
Yes, as I told you, we have a thematic hub, which also for management of resources-wise, we have included gender, human rights, and anti-discrimination in general. And regarding gender in particular, we are working with our partners and members and projects to have a gender and anti-discrimination approach in budgeting, for example, for our local government. There is this practice of this gender-based local government approach. We are also working in facilitating the access to local politics to women and to stimulate and prepare, inform about the possibility of being engaged at the local level for those who are younger or also who are discriminated by possibilities and capacities. And there is a lot to do. Because data are nice, but then you also, in my head and in your head, we have a lot of stories. And we see not only data, but stories. And the data are confirming the stories and the other way around. So I think that there is a lot to do. We are also working on local governments. We are working in schools. Some of our projects are addressing schools. And also, it's not easy, Alejandro, but we sometimes manage to enter the educational system also via the local governments. And we are also working with small kids to dismantle the discrimination or these ideas of girls and boys, and also having the girls, put in a basket rather than in another. We are working also on practices of citizens' participation. And very often, and we are working with a Barcelona-based organization, Time in Use initiatives. We realize that very often, also in citizens' engagement, women are discriminated because they have less time. So they have several burdens and they cannot free their time to participate, because also the issue of participation needs time to participate, to go to events and to be involved in a political dimension, but you also need time to get prepared. So sometimes you have time to get out of the house, but sometimes you don't have time to get prepared. So we are also working on citizens' engagement mechanisms or having local political life, which will allow the participation of women, because that takes place in moment of the day or in modalities that allows women to participate. ALDA has adopted, and conclude by this, a very strict policy on anti-discrimination. We have our own ethical papers, and we ask our members to subscribe our policies and also our usual providers, so that it has also an effect. I want to conclude by this, that gender, I often say and I feel that we have two big issues in the upcoming world. One is climate, apart from wars, yes, but one is climate and the second one is gender. I think we are just at the start of it.
Thank you. Yes, and very important point on really just raising it just from early ages and also starting at home. Just I'm aware of the time, so I just want to ask you a last question. So EuroVoices presents data just at the local level. So how do you think that local data, people-centered data is important for informing just your work, decisions, just at the local level?
Well, data is fundamental for effective governance and effective choices, and don't make mistakes or orient the policies. And I think that, Alejandro, we don't have enough. It's always very partial. I would say that most of the political policy making is often based on a very limited understanding of the data. They try to have more, but not enough. And I think that data can also introduce the credibility of the policy and can be more strategic. So I really I really think that this is what we can do more. I prepared some two elements. For example, ALDA is working with the program SERVE, which is the Right and Value programs of the European Commission. Citizens, Equality, Right and Values, which is the next one of Europe for Citizens. And together with the SERVE programs, we have an operating grant, we have a lot of projects, we work on all the components of this program. They are collecting a lot of data, and with questionnaires in order to be able for the future to have more data. But I want to say two things. The first thing is that recently we fill up these questionnaires. They are very complex and very long, but our participants, for example, it happened to me in Paris last week, and there was a question about the gender, and the people don't want to tick the box on gender, whatever you are perceiving being yourself. So it's complicated to collect data on this, because the people are coming to me and say, why do you ask? Pourquoi tu demandes ça? Why are you asking this? So this is just an observation that we observed last week. The other element is that we struggle, and ALDA is in this process, maybe somewhere else in the room, somebody else in the room is doing this. There are also, about these questionnaires, they are very quantitative. And we are opening a Pandora box about the qualitative elements of those data in the SERVE program and many others. So it's complicated because, for example, introducing a qualitative, and I may work with you more, but for example, we are counted by number of people we are mobilizing. So the EU wants us to mobilize a certain number of people, and we are counted by head. But I will often say that not every head is the same. Because if you work in Brussels and you have 20 people in Brussels, you preach to the convinced ones. But if you organize somebody with 20 people in the center of Bulgaria or in a small village in the center of France, I have the impressions that those heads worth more if you want to make awareness on European issues, on information, so we are trying to discuss the qualitative aspect of those data. It's, as I said, a Pandora box because it introduces complexity. But for example, in ALDA, we are trying to propose something which is manageable, but that will add something to those data.
Well, thank you, and we'll be happy to collaborate with you on those projects. Lauren?
The insightful conversation, and I know that if we had more time, we would have more things to discuss. So I've got some questions from our audience, and I'm going to, because we have limited time, I'm going to try to kind of combine them because they do cover similar themes. So Alejandro, I think the first one is for you. We got quite a number of questions about the methodology for collecting responses from the experts and the general population. So could you share a little more data about, or a little more information about how we contacted the respondents, how we selected them, and how we ensured that the data validation process was stringent and there was credible and unbiased responses in the results?
Thank you, Lauren. This is we put a lot of effort into this. So first, on the data from the public, we developed the questionnaires and then identified different polling companies, invited them to participate. The data collection happened through either online or face-to-face. We made sure that the samples were representative of the population on each one of the regions. In each one of the regions, we collected 500 responses just to more than 200 questions. Then throughout the process, we had several phases for data quality, just from the moment in which we work with them on the sample to the application of the questionnaire, depending on how it was applied. So we had pilots to validate the results, and then eventually, once we had the full data set, we compared it against a large number of potential comparable sources to see the trends, to see data that we had collected in the country in the past, to see whether just the data was consistent. When there were issues, we talked to the polling company or just tried to identify what the source of the problem was. In the case of the experts, so what we did was identify, in some cases, the population of lawyers through just public searches, directories, connections with bar associations or with different associations that work with lawyers across the EU, work with them and identify a database of about 250,000 lawyers, and we invited them to participate. We developed the questionnaires, so there are 4 questionnaires, and the questionnaires were in 12 languages, so we sent them the questionnaires, and it was a voluntary exercise. As I mentioned in the presentation, there are about 8,000 responses. Once we collected that, then we review just the different responses. We remove outliers, and validate it against quantitative, qualitative, and news. So it was a very extensive exercise just to check that the data was correct, and in the end, we visualize information and show the results.
Thanks. Antonella, I'm going to turn to you next. I think our audience is quite interested in hearing from you on how the data can be used for action. So some questions for you on how local governments could bring the data to action, what can local governments do, as well as local organizations like ALDA and legal professionals. So how can we use this data for results?
Well, I think that especially at the local level, which is the level of the action, actually. So they put in place national legislation, but they are also those who are there to react to the emergencies, or I mean, they put in place everything at the end is local, because they are those levels which are putting in place the policies. I mean, the data, you don't do anything without the data. So they tell you information about housing, they tell you information about social needs, they tell you information about schooling system, so other matters which are of competencies of the actions of the local government. So I think that especially the local level is interested in data. Recently, for example, in our migration flagship, I attended a big event organized with Eurocities last week in Bologna, and that was there were a representation of at least 50 cities in Europe. And one of the first things to do when you deal with migration elements is to understand, and this is very difficult, who is in your city and who are there. For example, also if you want to include them in some policy making, so data and policy making, and also action of programs are based on data, especially at the local level where the actual action take place.
Thank you. Alejandro, the next question is for you. This question is about the difference between WJP's Global Rule of Law Index and Eurovoices. So WJP's Global Rule of Law Index, which is one of WJP's flagship research products, is known for global data and the rule of law. So could you talk a bit about how Eurovoices correlates with the index and how decision makers can kind of draw comparisons between the two tools?
Yes, it's a good question. So first, these are two separate exercises. So we have the global index that even though they use a similar framework, just they are two different exercises. One is collected every year. The rule of law index is collected in 143 countries, uses information from practitioners around the different countries, and is published annually. So the EuroVoices exercise, this is the first time that we're collecting it, is at the subnational level. The conceptual framework is, even though it's based on the index, is different. The indicators are different, are really tailored to the European reality, and produces indicators at the subnational level. So the indicators are not strictly comparable, but they are complementary. So in the sense that the rule of law indicators really tell us about trends, so it's useful usually. It takes some time for rule of law trends, either positive or negative, to materialize. So just the index is a very good tool for indeed showing these changes over time in a large number of countries. The EuroVoices allows to go into more granular data at the subnational level, just at least in this stage, which is the initial exercise. So it has been built in a way that it could be expanded or collected over the years, but this is the first exercise. It's again it shows more information, but it's only just for this particular time period at the subnational level.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. And this next one, I'll pose to both of you. So the question is about the other rule of law diagnostic tools that exist in the EU. So there's the annual rule of law report and the EU Justice Scorecard. So what does a product like EuroVoices add to this menu of existing tools, and how can it complement them? So I'll turn to maybe Alejandro, you can start, and then Antonella.
Sure. I think that there are a lot of tools just in Europe just to measure justice, rule of law, a lot of different quantitative and qualitative tools. So the rule of law report is a very comprehensive exercise, just based first on qualitative information and informed by quantitative information. Usually it's done at the national level, so there are a lot of different data sets as well, just done at the national level. EuroVoices is a first exercise going at the subnational level. There are not a lot of information just at the subnational level. As I mentioned, as part of the exercise that we did, the first part of at the beginning of the project was really to identify all the different data sources available at the subnational level. And there were not that many just on the topic of justice, governance, the rule of law. There are many just at the national level, so I think that is a first difference and a first contribution of the exercise. I think it's broad. I think just even at the national level, just it complements the available information. So there are some pieces that are not available elsewhere, even at the national level. So I think it complements really, and I think that was the intention from the outset, that it was a tool just that could help just other tools available just in the toolkit of policymakers.
Well, I'm not familiar with the whole series of judicial justice reports and rule of law reports of Europe. I found this one interesting because it's simple to read. It put together not only the judiciary, it puts together also other elements which are contributing to understanding that part. So also the fact that this document includes different aspects, for me it's an added value, because to have only the legal perspective, situation of the judiciary, the judges, etc., maybe it's one part of it. So I like the way that it's simple to read, and it goes regional, which I mentioned. It's a nice thing, yes.
Terrific, thank you. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for submitting a question to help us enrich the conversation. So we're gonna wind down our program, but before we do, I wanna just take this opportunity on behalf of the World Justice Project to thank you to all of the people who made EuroVoices possible. So that includes the more than 64,000 people who answered the general population poll and the more than 8,000 legal experts and academics who filled out our surveys, as well as the representatives from EU institutions, international organizations, bar associations, civil society organizations, and academia who provided critical feedback at various phases of the project. And of course, there we go. This is the team, the incredible World Justice Project team who made all this possible and who some of us are here today. So to close us out, we now have a video message from the World Justice Project's co-founder and president, Bill Newcomb.
Hello, I'm Bill Newcomb, a co-founder and the president of the World Justice Project. I want to thank the thousands of experts and people of all backgrounds across the EU who are the very voices behind the World Justice Project EUROVOICES. Let me also thank our staff for collecting and analyzing this valuable data. Thanks also to each of you who have joined us today, either in person in Brussels or online. The World Justice Project will work with you to address new challenges to the rule of law revealed by this data from EuroVoices. After all, the rule of law recession is the very seminal issue of our time. Let me repeat, the rule of law recession is the seminal issue of our time. It's the foundation of healthy communities of justice, opportunity, and peace. The European Union recognizes this point and has made the rule of law a cornerstone of its membership and of virtually all of its work. EU countries consistently top our global rankings because they uphold the universal rule of law principles: accountability, just law, open government, and impartial and accessible justice. But today, let's face it, democracy and fundamental freedoms are under pressure in EU member states. Not all of their communities enjoy the same EU rule of law protections. These disparities hinder equitable economic opportunity as well as social cohesion, and thus the well-being of literally millions of people across the EU. we believe the World Justice Project EUROVOICES can be a powerful diagnostic tool for advancing your critical work for justice, equality, and democratic governance. Ultimately, of course, lasting change must take root at the local level. So please, explore the unique subnational data we have just produced and use EuroVoices to advance evidence-based policies that ensure that every EU community is a vibrant community. Thank you again, and onward we go together.
Okay, thank you all once again for joining us. Let me once again thank Antonella. We invite you all to visit the website and to explore the data yourselves. And we do hope this event is just the beginning of this important conversation about rule of law and good governance and data. So with that in mind, I do want to call attention to this audience that in June 2025, the World Justice Project is going to host the World Justice Forum, which is our international rule of law conference, in Warsaw, Poland. And the forum is a multi-day convening for rule of law champions from around the world to learn, to collaborate, and to take action. And next year's forum will focus on reversing authoritarian trends and will have an important track on the power of subnational data to advance rule of law. So please mark your calendars, and we hope you will join us in Warsaw to continue this important conversation. So with that, we've come to the end of the program. For those of us here in person, please stay. We've got some coffee out in the front. And for those of you online, thank you for joining us. Good afternoon.